Thank you so much for having me. The perennial question, they always say that if there's a newspaper article and it asks a question, the answer is always no. And so I liked the idea of coming here today and maybe being posed a question where the answer was yes. So the idea that maybe we should be optimistic about work was a hopeful prospect for me. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Bruce Daisley. I worked for a long time in big tech firms. I worked for Google for a while. I worked for Twitter. The great thing about using the word Twitter now is it immediately bookends. It says you didn't work for that guy. Even though it's a bit dated, it's increasingly, as time goes on, it's a bit like saying, oh yeah, I was OG at MySpace. It sort of places you at an era in the internet that's disappearing into the horizon, but it means that I didn't work for that man, and so it makes me happy about that. But I became obsessed with workplace culture. I worked in media, I worked in, obviously I went to work for the tech firms, and I think I was intrigued in that era. I was intrigued in that era about what made good workplace culture. I don't know if you're like me, if you've ever worked in a bar or restaurant or in hospitality, if you've ever had to do that. There's a really interesting thing that you learn pretty quickly is that you turn up and you do that job and you realize not all of these jobs are made alike. And you discover very quickly that the way you interact with each other often has an impact on the way you interact with customers. And sometimes respect runs through these environments. So I became fascinated and obsessed with workplace culture, the dynamic it creates. When I got the opportunity to work for big tech firms, I thought, oh, but that's the best form of culture, isn't it? Because I've seen it, I've searched online. And in hindsight, I should have checked where I searched, but searched online, what is the best company to work? And Google popped up, so I'm going to work at the best place. And I discovered very quickly that these places didn't necessarily have a better culture than anywhere else, not necessarily worse, but they were very good at advertising what their culture was. They were good at promoting it, good at being on the front foot. And I think the challenge that we're being posed here is, should we be optimistic about the future of work, is that I think a lot of us find ourselves in a zone worrying if things are going to get worse. Are you familiar with the idea of enshittification? So enshittification was the word of the year last year in one of the dictionaries when they're wrapped up, and it's a concept that's existed for a couple of years, actually. I think it was Clay Shirky, who's like an internet, he chronicles what's happening in the internet. And he described this phrase, enshittification, of how things get worse over time, often driven by the demands of trying to show more profits. That Google search used to be really good at getting you the results you wanted. And now there's about 20 ads on that page. If you search on your phone on Google, you can't even work out what the good stuff is meant to be. Or Amazon used to have this magical ability to take you to a product. And now you find yourself trying to struggle to find the precise thing you're looking for. And he captured that phrase, enshittification. And to some extent, we've witnessed an enshittification of work, right? That work maybe used to be a place that we connected with other people. We felt like we would go to work. My enjoyment of work was pure and simple. I used to love going to work and laughing every day. If I'd gone home at the end of the day and I said, I've laughed 10 times today, it was part of how I felt human. But we've definitely witnessed an enshittification. And obviously, when I was preparing these slides, I thought, I'm going to capture some of that. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Here's a real email that happened just before Christmas. It says, "Dear team, recently we conducted a survey to understand your feelings about stress at work." I've anonymized who said it. "As a company committed to sustaining a healthy workplace, we've considered the feedback. To ensure that no one remains stressed at work, we have made the difficult decision to part ways with those employees who indicated significant stress." They've solved it. They've actually cracked the code of the burnout epidemic just requires us firing all the people who have burnout. Work used to be so much more simple, but these people have cracked the code. I like this one. I found myself spending a lot of time on Reddit forums, and I saw this on Reddit, which was, "The guy who started today is clearly not the guy we interviewed," and no one else has noticed. And this goes on to detail a situation that they have. You don't need to read detail the situation that they had where a guy who, when it came to his very technical interview on a Teams call, had answered questions very well, but clearly that's not the dude who's turned up in reception. Work used to be so much more simple, and not only have we seen an enshittification, an overload, we've also, it's immensely more complex. I'll give you a perspective of that. One of the things that often happens, and I'll go on and reflect on this, one of the things that often happens is whenever any of us are invited to speculate on the way that work has changed, we look at things that are very visible and tangible and right in front of us. And so your boss might say, I'll tell you how work's changed. People aren't coming into the office every day. You know, you're telling me work's not as good. Well, I can see the reason why. And actually, no doubt, where we do our work has transformed. But the big change that's happened to work is that if you take the data that we've seen, is that in the last 10 years, the amount of time we spend in meetings has trebled. Far from the idea that where we do our work is the big disruption. The big disruption is many people find themselves coming into the office to sit on back-to-back Teams calls all day. It's a version of work that didn't exist before, but your boss isn't bothered about that because they're sitting in their corner office, they're not necessarily noticing these things. But the big things that have happened in work aren't necessarily the things we notice. In fact, most of us have found our whole working career has been characterized by bosses saying to us, just so you know, we're restructuring and we're going to restructure again in a year. You need to get used to constant change. Constant change is the way it's going to be around here. Then some change happened, you doing a little bit of work on Mondays at home, and they didn't like that change. We want the other change, which is there's going to be fewer people doing the jobs, and you're going to be crammed into a slightly tighter space. That's the change we like. We don't like the other change. And so it's really interesting. Actually, flexible working has been the most popular change and the most disruptive change to the way we work. Fundamentally, it's the single most popular thing that's happened in 20, 30 years to work. And yet the people who don't necessarily like it are bosses. And the reason why that matters is that in bad economic times, so, you know, if we're answering the question right now, should we be optimistic about the future of work? It's very difficult to separate the moment we're in from that question. And in difficult economic times, what we witness is herding. Herding of organizations, leaders, they look to what other leaders are doing, and they think we're going to copy that. Actually, in positive times, we don't do that. We differentiate. We try and prove that we've got something different, special, magical, separate. But in difficult times, we often herd. So, how have we seen herding? Well, almost every organization in the course of the last 2 years has found themselves reducing the amount of people they've got, reducing headcount. Quite often, this will be in organizations who are quite profitable. But because everyone else was doing it, it felt like we need to do that. This is the expectation of the moment. But we're seeing herding in a couple of other ways. Firstly, you've witnessed more organizations are talking about we need to get the gang back in the office. We're thinking, we've had fun with this remote working thing. It was fine, but I think we need them back in the office every day, doing their Teams calls next to each other in sort of these tightly contained. We want more background noise. Our vibe is that when you're on a Teams call, we want there to be a real annoying buzz in the background. It's got to feel like you're doing calls from Euston Station. That's the sort of the way we communicate our culture here. And we've seen some herding. So we've seen organizations thinking it's now time for us to invite people back. And actually, it shows I think the peril of these things, that rather than necessarily looking at the data, we've looked into what other people are doing. I just want to contextualize what changes have happened. So I mentioned in the last 10 years, the amount of time we spend in meetings has trebled. But there's also been big changes in terms of what it means to do different jobs. There's a really interesting thing. People over a certain age don't know what the website Spare Room does. I've never heard of it. Okay. Don't you open a copy of Loot or some sort of antiquated newspaper? Don't you find house shares by pinning a notice to a notice board? They've never heard. But Spare Room do some really interesting analysis. And I find this fascinating to try and notice how society has changed. Spare rooms say that there isn't a single postcode in London that is affordable on a graduate salary. Minimum wage is £21,500. It's sort of worth putting it into, most of us know it maybe as an hourly rate, but minimum wage is £21,500. And so if in addition to being on something just above minimum wage, you're expected to come into the office every day, if you can't afford to live in zones 1 to 6 in London, there isn't a single postcode affordable on a starter salary. If you're living in Watford, about 12, 15 quid coming in every day. Or if you're living in Croydon, about £12 coming in every day. If you're living in these places, then actually it becomes a really big burden on you making your journey into the office. But that's not what your boss remembers. Your boss remembers they lived in zone 2 and maybe zone 3. They can zip into the office. And so they characterize a version of work that just doesn't exist. Really interestingly, Spare Room do something else. They say that the average age of people in a house share used to be, as recently as 2016, it used to be 24. The average age of people in a house share now is 32. It means half of the people in house shares are in their 30s or above. That's a version of work that your boss doesn't recognise. And yet when they're asking people to come back to the office, they're describing a moment, a buzz, an energy that actually, firstly, you wouldn't recognise if you went in. And secondly, is just unaffordable for the way that people live. I guess I mentioned herding just because we witness herding in other areas. We saw last week that Facebook cancelled their diversity and inclusion programs. They're herding because they're copying other businesses that are doing that. McDonald's did that. We've witnessed other firms, big US firms like Walmart have cancelled those programs. And organisations looking to each other for comfort is potentially it's a bad sign, because trying to undermine maybe some of the enlightenment we've achieved in the last few years just because other people are doing it is slightly alarming. So look, it's a sign of recession, and we shouldn't necessarily become too wedded to whether that's the right thing or whether that's the correct thing to do in the future. Typically, the best firms have differentiated themselves, and I would hope that long term, as the economy improves, we're going to witness that. But it's difficult, right? You find yourself in a situation where you sort of reflect on anything and you think, I'm stressed about the future. Actually, isn't AI going to make things worse? Isn't the changes that are happening societally, don't they all go badly? And I'm reminded whenever I sort of think like that, whenever I get anxious about, I think about a set of rules that I saw. Now, I'm not sure, Douglas Adams is, I've never read Douglas Adams' books, but he seems like a really lovely guy. He wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You know that? You probably know someone who's read that book, talks about it. But I think the reason why Douglas Adams, friend of people like Stephen Fry, the reason why it's popular, he just seemed like a really lovely guy who understood the intersection of the future, science fiction, what's happening, but also he said it in quite warm, comedic terms. But he had this set of rules for technology that I think are slightly timeless. And you might recognise this. Douglas Adams had this set of rules that I think actually can help all of us interpret how we think of what's coming next. He said, anything that's in the world when you're born is normal. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting. Anything invented after you're 35 is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it. And it's kind of helpful frame to look at things, because we see interesting patterns in this. If you look at university students, college students, 100% of college students are using AI. But when we look at the workplace, only about a third of people in their jobs are using AI. Effectively, people who see technology as native, something that's new, that's coming along, adapt it, assimilate it, and are quite inspired by it. But any of us who reach a position where we sort of think that we understand the world around us, we start getting a bit scared, we start putting up barriers, we start thinking about the things that can go wrong. It has a really critical, I think, limiting factor to the way that we look at the world and the way that we think that solutions might come along. So, should we be optimistic about work? Well, firstly, I sort of want to reflect on the way that work is evolving and potentially the upsides for us. There was a lovely interview done with Sam Altman a few months ago, And he asked people, he was asked, what would you advise people to do? What would you advise people to learn? Facebook, Meta have come out at the start of this year and said that 80% of the code that they're going to ship this year, 80% of the software they're going to develop is going to be written by AI. So if that's the context, asking Sam Altman, what would you advise people to learn, is really, I think, critical. And Sam Altman told the interviewer, I would advise them to learn soft skills. And I think it's probably an important reminder for all of us. There's something, I spend my time obsessed with workplace culture, working with organizations, and it's something that people often lose sight of. If you're ever running a pulse survey inside your organization, or if you're trying to make your culture better, the biggest predictor of whether people will say they're engaged with your company, whether they believe they've got a good job in a good place, isn't whether they think the strategy is good, or what they think of certain leaders, or whether they think the boss is a good person. The biggest predictor is whether they've got a best friend at work. It's really interesting, that is. Sort of the idea that having a best friend at work would even matter. Really interesting. Whenever I show this, I have to unpick this, actually. There's a challenge here, because a lot of people, when they see the phrase best friend, they go, what am I, 6? Yeah, best friend. And the people who did this research, Gallup, they tried to do it without the word best friend. Have you got a friend at work? And it didn't correlate. It had to be a best friend. And it sort of, I think it goes, I know what happens. The people who have an issue with this are men. And and there's something about being male, is like, we see a best friend as a potential bit of weakness. Because if I turn to my mate and say, you're my best friend, and he says, oh, and he doesn't reciprocate, then I feel like I'm a loser, I've failed, I've lost. And so we don't want to have a best friend because it's a potential sign of weakness. But do you have a best friend? Just between you, and do you have a best friend? I think the reason why it matters, did I put this in? I did. I think the reason why it matters, I skipped forward and I shouldn't have done that. I'll give you a trigger warning. I'm about to show some poetry. And I know it's been a long day, but I just want to, the reason why I'm going to show this is that I think it helps us understand why this matters. So this is by a poet called David White, and it's about friendship. It's really brief. He says, friendship is the privilege of having been seen by someone, and the equal privilege of having been granted the sight of the essence of another. All right, calm down, David. But what I think you get about that, you know what I think when I see that? I think that's why I hated fucking Zoom quizzes. Because Zoom quizzes, you're sitting there and someone said, this one won't be like that one, this one will be good. And you turn up and you sat there. I don't know how long this pandemic's going to go on, but I'm never doing that again. Tell them I'm not well. Tell them I'm not doing it again. Because I think when you're sort of dialed in and you've got 30 people or 50 people there, superficially, it feels like you're connecting with people, but actually you're not. You don't feel seen. You don't feel understood. This isn't how human life works. Anyway, the reason why I think all that matters is still now, if you ask people the number one reason why they like their job, if you go on that website, Glassdoor, collection of very upset people on there. And but if you ask people on Glassdoor what the most important thing is, they'll say more important than pay is good workplace culture. And if you understand that good workplace culture is about friendship, then I think we're starting to get to something. Jeff Bezos gave this little quotation. Sorry to mention another man, but he said something that was quite valuable. He said he's always asked what's going to change. And he said a much more valuable question is asking what won't change. That's really interesting, because I think these things are really critical and fundamental. And if we understand that the things that won't change are the need for connection, the need for friendship, the human skills, the need to develop soft skills, the need to understand, you've probably got colleagues who are incredible at getting on with people, incredible at solving problems. Those skills are never going to go away. And the opportunity, I think, going forward is that if we do channel that Douglas Adams, if we do think that actually this isn't fearsome and we're not going into an unknown that's going to be the ruination of all of us, but actually it's an opportunity and it presents something for us, then actually the opportunity that we're looking at right now is that AI gives us the chance to rehumanize work. And it gives us the chance to look at the mess that we've made of work in the last few years. The fact that the burden of it has grown and grown and grown. And we're spending so much time on video calls that could be meetings, that could be emails, and we're answering all these pings. And the opportunity presented to us, if we're optimistic and if we're willing to think about how we harness technology, is that the things that humans are really good at, the humanization, is right in our opportunity. The opportunity is sitting there for us to bring some sense of connection back to work. So I think when we reflect on where we're going and what we're doing, the stuff that we really love about work, whether we're introverted or whether we're extroverted, feeling seen and feeling understood is the huge opportunity here. And I mentioned right at the outset, when I got interested in workplace culture. When you walk into restaurants and you walk into these places, you can witness which places are doing something special. You can witness which places value the contribution that people make. I think that's the opportunity. So if right now we're in a moment where a lot of firms are hurting, a lot of scared leaders are thinking, what can we do to copy other people? And the opportunity going forwards is that anyone who's inspired to try and do something special, to try and do something enlightened, is going to be given the chance to prove that difference, to lean into the difference that great people can make and build really strong cultures. So am I optimistic about the future of work? Unequivocally, yes, because the moment we're entering into now is the moment where bold, brave people are going to have an impact and make a difference in the organizations they're building. Thank you.